Welcome to Troubleshooting Innovation, a commercial baking podcast, sponsored by Lalamun Baking, a fermentation-based ingredient supplier committed to reinforcing the goodness of grain. I'm your host, Joanie Spencer, Editor-in-Chief of Commercial Baking. This season, I'm speaking with Julie Miller-Jones, a member of the Grain Foods Foundation Scientific Advisory Board, and Charlotte Martin, registered dietitian and consultant for the Grain Foods Foundation. And we are debunking bread myths to help bakers develop delicious, healthy, grain-based products and help them educate their consumers on the health benefits of bread. In this episode, we tackle the myth around bread's connection to the glycemic index. Hi, Julie. Hi, Charlotte. Thanks for joining me again this week.
Thanks for having us again.
So, this is an interesting one for me. There's a sentiment that circulates among consumers that if they're diabetic or they're concerned about their blood sugar, that they should avoid bread. This feels a little bit misguided. So can you guys help me unpack this and understand, what's the truth here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this idea that those with diabetes or those concerned about their blood sugar should completely avoid bread is definitely misguided. The key here is not to avoid bread, but to make informed choices about the type of bread, the quantity or portion size consumed, and of course, what you consume it with. So bread, like any other carb-rich food, can impact blood sugar levels, but the effect depends greatly on the type of bread. So whole grain breads, for instance, are richer in fiber, which helps slow the absorption of carbs and therefore dampens the blood sugar response. And also pairing bread with healthy fats, proteins, and or more fiber can help slow the absorption of carbs even more, leading to a more gradual rise in blood sugar. So an example of that would be like good old avocado toast, a slice of bread with fiber-rich avocado on top and a protein-rich egg, maybe some greens on top. So the takeaway here is not to fear bread, but to understand how to incorporate it wisely into a balanced diet, especially for those managing diabetes or who are concerned about their blood sugar levels.
Julie, do you have anything to add around the truth behind this?
Well, I think Charlotte said it very well. I am not a proponent of the glycemic index at all. I think the glycemic response of a person is very important. But the glycemic index has a lot of flaws in it. In fact, there was a study with hundreds of people and meals, and they showed that the glycemic index was not a good predictor of what would happen when people ate things. This is not when they eat them alone. For instance, one person had, as we would expect, when they ate a banana, which has sugar in it, the blood sugar went way up. Another person, it was completely flat. A cookie for that person that was completely flat went way up. And a cookie for the person who ate the banana was completely flat. So it really is a very poor predictor for people who are normal or who have diabetes as to what is going on. The International Glycemic Index Registry from the University of Sydney shows if you just type in white bread, you can get a glycemic index from extremely low, like 30. They have some that have glycemic indices of 30, and you can get them that are over 100, which is extremely high. But most of them are between 55 and 75, putting them in the moderate, or if they're over 70, in the higher. And so I really think it does not make any sense to look at the glycemic index, and that diabetics, especially those who have continuous glucose monitors, see what a particular food does to their glycemic index. And what we know is if we take bread or potatoes or other carbohydrate things, and we put some, as Charlotte mentioned, healthy fat on them, then the glycemic index really goes much lower. And so we need to look at the whole meal again, rather than all of the glycemic indices are done On students, usually in the 20 to 30s, they use 10 of them, and they, I would say, are not representative at all of the population. So the index, I think, is very flawed and is useful in research and not useful as a meal planning thing. People should really know more about what it does to their blood glucose. And some diabetics need a slow acting carbohydrate to act so that when they wake up in the morning, they don't have a low blood sugar. And so therefore, eating a peanut butter sandwich at night or an avocado toast at night might be ideal. And so people need to know what really makes them healthier.
Mm-hmm. So, Charlotte, I'm interested to sort of tap into your experience as a dietitian, because I think your conversations that you have with individual consumers would be very useful for bread producers. How are you advising people who have these kinds of concerns? And I'm curious, like, is this a hard assumption to change? What do you hear consumers saying about blood sugar concerns?
Yeah. Blood sugar is a hot topic on social media these days. So you have a lot of people, without diabetes who are wearing the CGMs to monitor their blood sugar levels throughout the day. We touched on this last episode. I think, again, a lot of people have become carbophobes for many reasons. And it's very hard right now to change the assumption that, bread can't fit into a weight management or blood sugar management diet. So I do mostly nutrition education on social media. So I'm talking to a lot of people at once. What I like to do is highlight the research that shows that grain intake is linked to cardiometabolic benefits, including weight loss, blood sugar management, and then also educate them on how to shop for more nutritious grain products like breads. So this might involve education on reading a nutrition label, which a lot of people don't know how to interpret, understanding ingredient lists. And, I find that to be effective, and just constantly reiterating that pretty much anything can fit into the diet if the majority of your diet is made up of nutrient-dense, mostly plant-based foods.
So do you get to see sort of metaphorical light bulbs go off when you're educating people through social media on how to read a nutrition label? Are you getting good responses on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually, one of the videos that I did was on bread. So, reading nutrition labels for bread. If you're trying to find like 100% whole grain bread, because that can be so confusing, again, with all of the different labels like multi-grain and whatnot. And then when you're looking at the ingredient list and it says wheat flour, and I even for so long just assumed wheat flour meant whole wheat. So, looking for like a certain fiber to carb ratio on the packaging. Yeah, I think a lot of people, it's like, oh, okay, this is easier than I thought. This makes sense.
Okay, so that leads me to my next question. Julie, you talked about the glycemic index. It's impacted by so many different factors. So when we're looking at bread, it can be impacted by things like processing or flour types or other ingredients that are included in a formula. So what do bakers need to know about their products and the ways that they're made, how they impact these types of consumers? So if you take your knowledge of how subjective, I guess, the glycemic index is, and you pair it with Charlotte's knowledge of how people are reading labels and responding to what labels say, how do bakers need to see how it's impacting people's choices?
Well, I think while I gave you the example of people who were at the extremes and why the glycemic index didn't work for everyone, there are some things that can help lower glycemic index, and bread makers can include those. One is, I talked already about resistant starch. Resistant starch does lower blood sugar. Things like beta-glucan, which comes from oats, not only lowers blood sugar, but it also lowers blood cholesterol. Beta-glucan is a type of fiber, and other fibers may also help do that. Use of large chunks or pieces. So seedier breads. Now I love them, and I know the people who want their bread just as smooth as they can get. But seedier breads and chunks of kernel of grains, they are processed in the body more slowly. So that's another way. Actually, there's some studies that show that if they want to change processing, actually to the way you can make resistant starch, and there are those kinds of biscuits that you can buy that are for breakfast that don't raise your blood sugar. They do that by heating and cooling, heating and cooling, heating and cooling. So there are processing techniques that you can do with the flour or the starch that can slow down its absorbability. Those kinds of breads that have a denser texture, actually they did 10 minutes kneading versus 15 and showed that 15 minutes kneading slowed down the release of the starch from the bread per se. Now, I know every minute on the floor costs money, but if people could say that it was a lower glycemic index, it might be worth the gain. Or you could talk to your supplier and see if they can provide that resistant starch piece or flour blends. I think that both Charlotte and I have mentioned before, are all ways that you can help reduce the glycemic response, and that may actually slow the rate at which glucose goes into the body. The airiest bread you have means that the enzyme can really easily penetrate. That's the reason you take French bread, which is flour, water, yeast, and salt, and you take pasta, which is flour, water, and salt. Pasta, because the texture is very compact, has a very low glycemic index. Same ingredients with an airy texture has a high glycemic response. And so can you alter the texture somewhat so that it's still very palatable, but it's a little denser, a little harder for the enzyme to penetrate? Add butter or a healthy oil, and that also slows down. Sourdough, also bringing your pH of the crumb away from neutral by sourdough or adding acid will actually lower the glycemic response.
Interesting. Yeah, those are some great hidden gems, especially in ideas of how bakers can process their breads to really enhance the health benefits. I love that. Lallemand Baking is proud to sponsor this season of Troubleshooting Innovation. As a supplier to the baking industry and member of the Grain Foods Foundation, Lallemand is committed to reinforcing the goodness of grain and sharing credible sources of information to communicate the health benefits of bread. Okay, you guys, so I participated in the webinar that you did with the Lallemand workforce, which I absolutely loved. And one of my favorite things was just seeing employees at Lallemand getting excited about the things that they learned about bread, which was really cool. One thing that you guys said is that whole grain bread consumption was associated with a reduced risk of type 2 diabetes. And I found that to be very interesting. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that for me.
Sure. I believe that was my talking point from the webinar. And I had mentioned a study that examined the relationship between bread consumption and the risk of type 2 diabetes. And it was done in over like 400,000 participants. And so it found that higher bread consumption, and this was mostly of whole grain bread, was associated with a reduced risk of type 2 diabetes. So those with the highest intake of whole grain bread had a 20% lower risk of type 2 diabetes. But it also found that the highest intake group for total bread, so both whole and enriched white bread, had a 17% lower risk of type 2 diabetes. You know, I think that just goes to show that all bread can be included in a healthy diet, so long as you do make it a priority to include some whole grain bread in there.
Okay.
Yeah, because one of the cohorts in that group is the Iowa Women's Health Study. And those people who ate 2.7 servings, almost 3, whole grain bread had the lowest risk of type 2 diabetes and a whole bunch of other things. But they actually had a total of about just 6 servings of bread. And that's one of the reasons that the dietary guidelines says make half your grains whole. The other reason is they want people to eat fortified enriched grains because of the nutrients that they carry, and they're better absorbed from fortified enriched refined grains than some of the minerals are, and even the vitamins, than they are from whole grain. So you get better absorption and you actually have the diabetes win. So, and other health risks are lower too. So I think that's really exciting piece of information. And they do way better than people who eat no grain, by the way.
I think we need to get that message out more aggressively.
There's a study where they looked at the people who ate no grain, and they always, on just about every metric, did worse.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, that's a conversation that I don't hear being put out there, as far as you hear all the people say, oh, I stopped eating carbs and all of these great things happened to me. But we haven't really gotten that conversation out there about when people stop consuming grains, they have a higher risk of these health issues.
And Joanie, the one that scares me to death is the one about folic acid. There's a study that came out of NC State where they looked at women who were on a no grain or a low carb diet for the year prior to them conceiving. And what happened was they had a 30% higher risk of neural tube defects. And since 1998, when the US mandated that flour contain folic acid, we dropped the risk of neural tube defect and spina bifida by over 50% in North America. And to actually know how to stop it and have it come back makes me really sad.
So, where do you think this leaves bread bakers in terms of, I guess, missing out on opportunities? Like, how can they reach consumers who might be erroneously avoiding their products? And that seems like the phrase erroneously avoiding bread is like the whole no carb movement. But when you think about it relative to the glycemic index, if people think I have blood sugar concerns, therefore I can't eat bread, like how can bakers get through this myth from a production standpoint and from like a marketing or communication standpoint?
Yeah, I think they just really need to rely heavily on their marketing teams. And there's this big movement now of like wanting to know how your food is made and where it comes from and getting more of like a behind the scenes look. And I think that could work really well for bread manufacturers. It could be, hey, we created this new bread product that has less of a blood sugar response because we used X flour and, X baking or kneading technique and giving like little behind the scenes look. I think consumers would appreciate that. But again, I think it's really the marketing teams and creating that content and putting it on their social media channels and website. But I think it could be very helpful.
The other thing I would suggest is having the marketing team talk to dietitians credentialing in diabetes, or to the American Diabetes Association, where they say counting carbs is what matters. And they try to both debunk the myth about no grain. And a lot of people hold the myth about no fruit. Both of those are needed in the right amounts by diabetics. So if they could actually get permission to put some of the statements from the American Diabetes Association white paper on what people with diabetes should do, or partner with them in some sort of a communique, those also might be strategies that would be helpful.
I agree. I think partnering with dietitians is a great move. And I've seen a lot of brands, bread manufacturers, partner with dietitians on social media. It's not always to necessarily promote the health benefits of bread, but I think it can be very effective.
Or I probably clicked on a video and now it's like all over my feed, especially on Instagram. I'm a dietitian and this is what I eat in a day. These little stitches of dietitian showing this is what I'm fixing myself for breakfast, this is what I'm fixing for lunch. I think there's good opportunity from a partnership standpoint with brands. Like, I'm a dietitian and this is how I use X bread brand to make avocado toast. And these are the health benefits behind avocado toast.
Just this week, one of the dietitians that I know pretty well, the 6 ultra processed foods you should all be eating. And the number one was whole grain bread. Number 2 was whole grain cereals with low sugar. Number 3 was low sugar yogurt. So that's the kind of thing that would be incredibly helpful.
Yes, absolutely. I think having some kind of partnership with a dietitian or other health expert just really lends that credibility and breaks down that inherent mistrust that people have with food manufacturers. I think we've come a long way with that, though, especially in the past 5 years and with the increased visibility of supply chain since the pandemic, and people saw like the impact of the pandemic on the supply chain and what supply chain means. I think people have a better understanding of how foods are made and where the food comes from. So I think it's breaking down a little bit of that barrier. But I do think partnering with someone like you, Charlotte, to be able to say, here's how bread and other grain-based foods can be part of your healthy diet, even if you are diabetic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I do partner with brands, and I mean, not just bread or other grain products, but that is what I do. And that's actually what I'm doing with Grain Foods Foundation now. So every month, creating some sort of piece of content around either dispelling a bread myth or highlighting a benefit. And actually, I should add to my list something on blood sugar management and bread for those with diabetes, because I think that would be a great topic. But yeah, and it gets a lot of good feedback and engagement. So I think more of that would be very helpful.
I agree. Well, ladies, that really was my last question for this episode. Thank you so much. I learned so much. I feel like I'm going to end this conversation smarter than I started it. So thank you so much to both of you for enlightening me on these myths around the glycemic index and bread and carbs impact on blood sugar. This was really interesting. So thank you so much. So next week, we are going to talk about some assumptions around sodium levels, and then also dive into what consumers think of when they hear the term ultra processed, which is something that's really come into the American lexicon a lot lately. So I'm excited to dive into that with you guys, and we're going to unpack those two and clear the air and maybe have some more great advice for bakers. So thank you again for this conversation, and I look forward to speaking with you next week.
Thanks, Joanie.
Thank you for listening to Troubleshooting Innovation. And a special thanks to our sponsor, Lallemand Baking. Delivering solutions to bakers across the globe, Lallemand Baking is raising baking standards.